going to do just a really quick video on how to restore bolts. In case you're doing up a car or fixing an engine, something like that. As you take all the bolts off, well actually this is called a set screw because the thread goes to the very head, you're going to end up with a big pile of bolts to put back on the engine. If you've got the time, it's worth spending just a few minutes tidying these up, because it'll help you take it apart again later, because it'll be clean and be fresh steel. It'll also look an awful lot nicer. So here's an example. This is a actually I don't know what it is. It's a UNC, or maybe no, it's a UNF, sorry, bolt of some description. Can't even read it. It's a bit rusty. I've given it a quick wash and degreaser just to get any oil off it. You don't necessarily need to do that. But the first thing I'm going to do is give the thread a bit of a wire brush, then wire brush the head, then we're going to give it a bit of a polish. So I'll show you the best way to do that. Okay, I'm opting to do this in a lathe, which isn't strictly necessary. You could use a vise or pillar drill, but I happen to have a lathe, so it's quite convenient for me. So I'm going to start with the thread itself. So just open the chuck, put the head in. I'm going to hold it by the head. I'm going to hold this quite tight because there's no reason not to. You have to be more careful when we're holding it by the thread later. Just tighten that up. Start it spinning. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is just take it's a cordless drill with just a wire brushing attachment. Just clean that thread up nice, and do it in a way so you can see as well. Okay, let's stop that. Okay, that's pushed all the contaminants out of the thread there. We don't need to worry about the cosmetics of the thread too much, because you're never going to see that when it's in the engine. We're going to work on the top end of it now, the bolt head. So what I'm going to do is flip it around. Now, you want to be a bit more careful here, because if you pinch down on the threads too hard, you're going to damage the threads. And this is a steel bolt, so it's not such a problem if you're careful. If you're dealing with a brass one, then that is slightly more of a problem. You've got to be really careful. If you have some nuts to go on the bolt, I would put them on and hold the nuts rather than the thread, because you can hold the nuts a lot tighter. Just make sure that the way your lathe is rotating, that it doesn't mean that the bolt's going to fly out of the nuts, sort of unscrew. You might need to make sure they're nice and tight in that case. Alright, so I'm just going to put on sufficient tension that it will stop it moving. So I'm going to bring it out a little bit from that, maybe there, so I can get at it neater. Right, okay, that's probably about right. Fire it up again. Okay, let's get polish in here. And the top of it. Okay, let's get rid of all the rust. It says on it, you can read it now, 8GS, I'm not quite sure what that means. So it's nice and clean now like that, but what we're going to do is just give it a bit of a sand just to polish the head of it up there. So we're going to start with quite a coarse sandpaper. Tool I'm using is a cordless angle grinder with using a battery. Pretty effective. This paper here, start with this, it's 100 grit, that'll be fine. Don't need to go any coarser than that. What I'm going to start with is the 6 faces. Now, I don't want to take much off these at all, because then you're adjusting the size of the bolt, and when the spanner or the socket goes over the top, they'll have some play there. All we're going to do is just take off some of the casting, what you would call them, casting areas, let's call them that, just to bring them down nice and flat so they look a bit smarter. Next one. Okay, now for the next part we're going to do the bolt head itself with the lathe turning. Try and hold it in a way you can actually see it as well. The next thing I'm going to do, now the top of it's flat, is just bring the sander around just over the corner, just to give a bit of rounding to the points where they join the faces. Okay, so that's the 100 grit done, but it's left it quite rough, so we're going to change that for a different one now. I'm going to go with the 240, which is a little bit finer. a little bit nicer there. It's getting quite warm now. Alright, that's the 240. Ideally I'd have something like 500 or an 800, but I'm going to have to go straight to 1000. And it's an old piece as well, because I'm getting low on sandpaper. But that's alright, I'll go with 1000. Starting to look almost like a mirror now. If I can find it, let's see if I put something even finer on. This is 2,500. It's quite a well-used piece. I really ought to buy some more. So 2,500. It's really smooth. It does look a lot like a mirror now. Now I also have a polishing wheel. You're supposed to use with a paste, but you don't have to. Again, it's for an angle grinder. It's like kind of buffs it up quite nicely. It can make a lot of dust. It's looking pretty nice. Alright, stop the motor. Okay, the end of it's looking like a mirror. But what I'm going to do is use the finer paper on the faces just to sort of polish those down as well. Okay, let's just take that out. Hopefully you'll agree that's really nice shiny bolt head. What I'm also going to do with this bolt head is just lacquer it, because this is plain steel, even though it looks like it's stainless now. It's not, so that will rust unless it's got some kind of protective coating. So the way I do that, using an old knackered sort of sanding disc, and just push it through. This hole's not quite big enough for this bolt. Just push it through like that. That's fine. Put it back in the chuck. I don't particularly want to lacquer my lathe. Okay, so just got a kind of lacquer. This is heat resistant lacquer. It's good stuff. It'll protect the steel. I've set the lathe to a slow rotation, otherwise everything just sprays off it. Give it a nice coat. And give that 5 minutes. Okay, that's the end of the video. Hope you agree, that's a lovely shiny bolt now, looks much nicer than it did before, and that's going to look very smart on the engine.